Welcome to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session where I take on your science faith questions. At a new time, Mondays, 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, 7 p.m. For those of you on the East Coast. This week's question comes from three people, Abdallah Alahim, Daniel Levite, and Chris Snyder, who want to know, is irreducible complexity a good argument for intelligent design? Have evolutionary biologists refuted the irreducibly complex argument for design? I'm going to take on those two questions in just a few minutes, but before I do that, as always, I would like to ask those of you who are watching this broadcast to please take a moment and check in the comment section. Say hi, let us know where you're watching from, who you are. This is really valuable information for us as we plan future Facebook Live sessions, but also it's a way for me to get to know who you are. And in fact, the last time that we did a broadcast, which was last week, a number of you took the time to check in, including Billy Grimes from Nashville, Tennessee, and Collie James from San Clemente, California. So thank you so much for the both of you for checking in and saying hi. Also, please take a moment and react to the broadcast using the like button. This is really very helpful for us. Or if you have ways in which you think the broadcast could be improved, please offer your suggestions in the comment section. The more likes that we get for the broadcast, the more comments that we get, the greater the visibility the broadcast is in the Facebook feed. So by reacting to the broadcast, you're helping get the word out. You're helping to get this message out. Also, if you want to offer your perspective on irreducible complexity, intelligent design, and evolution, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section of this broadcast, even if your perspective is different from mine. As always, I want to foster an environment on my public figure and my personal Facebook pages where people can discuss science faith issues without concern for censorship. So please, again, take a moment to offer your thoughts on this broadcast. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started with this week's questions. First of all, what I'd like to do is read in detail the question that I received from Abdallah Alahim via a private Facebook message. Abdallah says this: sorry to bother you, Dr. Rana. By the way, when you send me a message, when you post something on my Facebook page, you're not bothering me. I love to hear from you. I may not be able to respond to everybody's comments or questions, but I read them and I carefully consider them. They mean a lot to me. They're important to me. So please don't ever think that by in making contact with me, you're bothering me. He goes on to say, I just wanted to ask you about the Bacterial Flagellum. Do you think it's irreducibly complex, and do you think it's a good refutation of Darwinism? One last question. Other than the flagellum, can you give me other examples which I can investigate that are irreducibly complex? So we're going to go ahead and take on Abdallah's questions, and along the way we'll introduce the questions from Chris Snyder and Daniel Levite as we look at this issue of irreducible complexity in the case for intelligent design and the challenge to biological evolution. And to get things started, what I'd like to do is make sure everybody who's watching this broadcast is on the same page. So I'd like to take a moment just to discuss the concept of irreducible complexity and how Christian apologists, creationists, and intelligent design proponents use it as an argument for design typically. And then we'll go ahead and unpack these questions that are being asked about the quality of the argument for design represented by irreducible complexity. Irreducible complexity is a concept that actually traces back all the way to William Paley in his book Natural Theology, published in the late 1700s. Paley never used the term irreducible complexity, but in advancing his Watchmaker argument for God's existence, he discusses concepts that are identical to the concept of irreducible complexity. Michael Polanyi, the philosopher of science and the physical chemist, introduced the term irreducible complexity in reference to life in his writings, but the scientist who probably has had the greatest impact in terms of this concept entering into the public discourse is, of course, Michael Behe, the biochemist from Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. In the mid-1990s, Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box, where he argued that biochemical systems are irreducibly complex. And because they're irreducibly complex, they cannot be accounted for through evolutionary mechanisms. Irreducible complexity refers to a system that is composed of a number of parts in which those parts have to interact in a precise manner in order for that system to have minimal function. If those parts do not interact in a just right way, or one of those parts is missing, that system has no function. And Behe argues that that type of a system cannot evolve in a stepwise manner through Darwinian evolution, because intermediate systems would not have function. Therefore, natural selection cannot operate on that system, selecting those intermediate systems along the pathway that would lead to the system that would be irreducibly complex in its final form. The idea here is that evolution works in an incremental manner, modifying existing systems, and if those modifications impart benefit to that organism, increase its fitness, increase its reproductive success, that change would be instantiated within that particular gene pool. If not, it's either going to be a neutral evolution that would not be necessarily selected for, or if it was deleterious or harmful, it would be eliminated from the gene pool through a negative form of natural selection. So Behe argues that irreducibly complex systems have to come together all at once simultaneously, and that there is not an evolutionary mechanism for that kind of origin event. Therefore, these systems must be designed. And Behe rightly points out that biochemical systems are irreducibly complex. Therefore, evolutionary mechanisms cannot explain their origin. These systems must be the product of an intelligent designer. Now, one of the systems that Behe discusses in his book, Darwin's Black Box, is the Bacterial Flagellum. And this biochemical system has become an icon for intelligent design. This is a massive protein complex that's embedded in the cell envelope of bacteria. This complex is comprised of over 40 different proteins, many of which occur in multiple copies that assemble into a massive complex that resembles a rotary motor that allows the bacteria to be propelled through its environment. And if even one of these component parts is missing, or if the component parts don't interact precisely, the flagellum has no function. It is the quintessential example of a system that is irreducibly complex. And again, the argument would be that these types of systems simply do not have explanation from an evolutionary standpoint, and therefore would have to be the product of design. So to answer part of Abdallah's question, basically every biochemical system is in effect irreducibly complex. Now, when Behe proposed this idea, I was just getting started in Christian apologetics. I had yet to join Reasons to Believe, but I was on a trajectory towards joining the ministry. And I was deeply impacted by what Behe described in his book, Darwin's Black Box. I was enamored with this idea of irreducible complexity. I thought Behe was onto something big, and so Behe's work served as inspiration for me as I began my work at Reasons to Believe, and helped to motivate two books that I wrote, Origins of Life, in which I co-authored with Hugh Ross, and another book called Cells Design, where I try to take Behe's idea of irreducible complexity and expand upon it, making the argument that there are many other features of the cell's chemical systems, like irreducible complexity, that could be used to make a case independently for design, and by combining them together, we can make a very powerful weight of evidence approach. I very much respect Michael Behe as a scholar, as a Christian gentleman, and someone who has incredible courage in terms of challenging the evolutionary paradigm and articulating one of the most intriguing arguments for design that has ever been proposed, I think, in Western thought. So a lot of respect for Michael Behe. But as soon as, of course, Behe's argument began to gain in popularity, there was a rebuttal that was leveled against the argument by evolutionary biologists, where they argued that a mechanism known as co-option, or sometimes exaptation, as Stephen Jay Gould dubbed the phenomena, could account for the emergence of irreducibly complex systems through evolutionary processes in a stepwise manner. And the idea behind co-option is this, that in evolution, you can have pre-existing systems that perform a particular function, and those systems can be duplicated through gene duplication events. And now that there are multiple copies of that system available in the genetic code, multiple copies of the genes instantiated in the genetic code, one is free to evolve while the other is constrained by natural selection, meaning that system can then be co-opted and modified to produce a new system that can even be built upon, that has a distinct function from the original system, and that process can be repeated over and over again to form the final system, where the intermediate systems in that process may not have the same function as the final system, but they have other functions that are critical for the organism's survivability and therefore are retained as part of this evolutionary pathway. And so, in other words, the evolutionary biologists argued that co-option is a mechanism that can explain the genesis of irreducibly complex systems. Now, to be fair, evolutionary biologists didn't conceive of this idea in response to Behe's argument. This idea has been part of the construct of evolutionary theory even before Darwin's Black Box was published. Now, in response to this idea of co-option, Chris Snyder, if I can find his question, Carl Snyder says this: "It seems to me that the blind watchmaker had to be very busy to produce the myriad of complex machines. It is not sufficient to judge Behe's explanation as having been disproved by the mere suggestion of another mechanism." And I'm sympathetic to what what Carl Snyder is actually arguing here. Because just because you're proposing a mechanism that could potentially explain the genesis of irreducibly complex systems doesn't mean that that mechanism can actually account for them. You have to roll up your sleeves and do a little bit more work as evolutionary biologists, proposing plausible pathways. And when I started with Reasons to Believe, there was quite a bit of discussion, again, centering on the bacterial flagellum. Ken Miller basically argued that if you view the bacterial flagellum as origins from an evolutionary standpoint, you can actually identify this co-option mechanism at play. And he pointed to what's called the type 3 secretory apparatus, which is a structure that looks very similar to the basal body of the bacterial flagellum. And this system is used to inject bacterial toxins in the form of proteins into host cells that the bacteria are invading. And so Miller argued that the type 3 secretory apparatus would be essentially an example of a system that could have been co-opted to generate the bacterial flagellum, where this system was essentially involved in bacteria pathogenesis and then was co-opted by the evolutionary process to generate the bacterial flagellum, which is used to propel the bacteria through its environment. The flagellum is used as a means for locomotion. Now, this is an interesting claim on the part of Miller that seems on the surface to suggest that maybe indeed co-option could be a valid way to explain the origin of irreducibly complex systems. But there's a number of problems with Miller's proposal. He basically made this proposal in more or less an armchair manner, as opposed to actually doing some real work towards this end. And researchers who have studied the relationship between the type 3 secretory apparatus and the bacterial flagellum actually have a debate going on where some evolutionary biologists are arguing that the bacterial flagellum actually predates the type 3 secretory apparatus and that the type 3 secretory apparatus evolved from the bacterial flagellum. Others argued that the type 3 secretory apparatus and the bacterial flagellum are one and the same system, where there is essentially a switch, a genetic switch that can be flipped that essentially produces either the type 3 secretory apparatus or the bacterial flagellum in bacteria, depending upon what's going on with that organism. And so these two models essentially undermine the idea that the type 3 secretory apparatus supports the notion that co-option can explain the genesis of the bacterial flagellum. And then on top of that, just as a minor point of, I think, contention, and that is this: the type 3 secretory apparatus itself is irreducibly complex. So you're not really explaining the genesis of irreducibly complex systems through co-option with this particular example. And as a Christian apologist in my early days with Reasons to Believe, I freely used irreducible complexity, following after the way in which Behe argued for, again, intelligent design using irreducible complexity. I was well aware of this idea of co-option and Ken Miller's argument and was able to respond to it, again, in a manner similar to what I just described. But all that changed for me in 2009. A team of researchers from Australia and the United Kingdom published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where they were looking at the evolutionary origin of what's called the TIM23 protein import machine. This is a irreducibly complex protein transporter that is embedded in the inner membrane of mitochondria that plays a role in mitochondria biogenesis, transporting proteins from the cytoplasm of the cell into the lumen of the mitochondria. Again, a very important protein that plays a role in the biogenesis of mitochondria. And it is an irreducibly complex system. We can show experimentally that if you remove one of the proteins that are part of this complex, the system no longer has function. If those proteins that are part of the complex don't interact in a precise way, this complex doesn't have function. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, mitochondria are believed to have originated through a process known as endosymbiosis. This is called the Endosymbiotic Hypothesis, where presumably some kind of mother cell, some kind of host cell, engulfed an alpha proteobacterium that established permanent residency within the host cell and developed a symbiotic relationship with the host. Over time, this endosymbiont underwent a loss of genes in its genome that were then taken up by, at least some of those genes, by the host cell genome, and through that process, this free living organism that became a permanent endosymbiont in the host cell evolved into an organelle known as a mitochondrium. And that if that's the case, then the inner membrane of the mitochondria would be homologous to the inner membrane of alpha proteobacteria. And in light of that, these researchers looked for proteins that were produced by alpha proteobacteria that were targeted to the inner membrane of this bacterium and discovered two proteins that they labeled TIM-A and TIM-B that were sequence and structural homologs to two of the proteins in the TIM23 protein transport machine. And based on the sequence similarity and the structural similarity of these proteins, they argued that these proteins, that the TIM-A and the TIM-B proteins that form or participate in complexes and protein complexes in the inner membrane, were the evolutionary precursors to the components, at least two of the components of the TIM23 protein transport machinery. And that these proteins, again, were co-opted from a completely distinct function from protein transport and evolved or retooled to interact with each other and other proteins to form this protein transport machinery. Now, to test this idea, they compared the amino acid sequences of TIM-A and TIM-B with the corresponding proteins in the TIM23 complex and identified a few amino acid differences in the sequence, and then used genetic engineering techniques to alter the amino acids of the TIM-A and the TIM-B proteins, and then took those proteins and incorporated them into the TIM23 complex in yeast, in the mitochondria found in yeast, and were able to produce a functional transport system. And on this basis, they argue that they've shown that co-option can be a way to explain the origin of irreducibly complex machines. A very interesting study. Now, I would argue as a sidebar that this work could be interpreted from a design framework where you could just simply argue the similarity between TIM-A and TIM-B and the proteins that are part of the TIM23 complex is essentially a reflection of the modular design of biochemical systems, where you have components that can be pieced together in a variety of different ways to produce a number of different types of functional systems. Or you could view them as part of an archetypical design that a creator used to build different types of machines in the inner membrane of alpha proteobacteria and the inner membranes of mitochondria by taking that archetypical design and modifying it for a variety of different functions, kind of following in the footsteps of Sir Richard Owens and his approach to biology, which is an archetype approach to biology. So the point is, you could understand this work from an intelligent design perspective. But if you're looking at this work from an evolutionary perspective, and the claim that is being made by Christian apologists, by creationists, by intelligent design proponents, that irreducibly complex systems cannot be produced in a stepwise manner, that claim no longer holds, because here's an instance where these researchers produced a plausible pathway for how the TIM23 system could have evolved in a stepwise manner. Have they fleshed out all the details? No. Have they proved unequivocally this is how this system emerged? No, but they presented a plausible pathway. And after seeing this work, I felt like I could no longer use irreducible complexity as an argument for design. At least the way in which irreducible complexity is used to argue for design. And what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about, again, the way in which this argument for design has been made using irreducible complexity as a biochemical feature. Because to me, it's not so much that the concept of irreducible complexity is a problem, but rather it's how that concept is deployed in the argument for design. Because the way in which I believe Michael Behe framed the argument, the way in which I see Christian apologists typically frame the argument, the way in which I see ID proponents and creationists frame the argument is in negative terms. That is, evolution cannot explain the emergence of irreducibly complex systems, therefore these systems must be the product of a designer. It's a negative argument for design. You're not making the argument based on the features of the cell's chemical systems that point to design, but rather you're focusing your attention on what evolution can or can't do, trying to argue that evolution cannot account for irreducible complexity, and therefore those systems must be designed. You're backing into the design conclusion when you frame the argument that way. And you're setting yourself up to be vulnerable to a God of the gaps critique, where a skeptic might very well accuse you of inserting God into a place of ignorance. And as we've now learned how these systems might potentially come about, you're now squeezing God out of the equation. And you also again are presenting an argument that's highly vulnerable, because all you have to do if you're a skeptic or an evolutionary biologist is produce one instance where you can plausibly say co-option could explain the origin of an irreducibly complex system, and now it's legitimate to use that as a potential mechanism to account for every system that's irreducibly complex, whether you actually have a plausible pathway or not. Why is that the case? Because you could always argue that we've yet to figure out what that pathway is, but we realize that this mechanism very well could account for that, and therefore we're justified in rejecting the claim of intelligent design and pursuing evolutionary explanations. Now, having said that, I don't believe that irreducible complexity is a bad argument for design. We just have to utilize that concept in a different way to argue for design. My preference when I argue for design is not to focus on critiquing evolutionary mechanisms, but rather my focus is on presenting a positive case for design based on the features of the cell's chemical systems that positively point to the handiwork of a creator. And towards this end, I really like the Watchmaker argument of William Paley. And in this argument that was presented in Natural Theology, Paley compares a watch to living systems, where he argues that a watch being made by a watchmaker has certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. And when we look at biological systems, according to Paley, we see those same qualities, those same characteristics, and these qualities and characteristics can be used to argue that living systems must be the work of a divine watchmaker. Because if certain properties reflect the work of a human designer, we see those same properties in biological systems. By analogy, we are right to conclude that those systems, again, come from the work of a mind. Let me read a little bit of Paley's argument for the watchmaker, for the divine watchmaker. He says this: when we come to inspect the watch, we perceive what we could not discover in the stone. That is, several parts are framed and put together for a purpose, that they are so formed and adjusted as to produce motion, and that motion so regulated as to point out the hour of the day. That if the different parts had been differently shaped from what they are, or placed after any other manner or in any other order than that in which they are placed, either no motion at all would have been carried on in the machine, or none which would have answered the use that is now served by it. And so this is a really interesting statement that Paley is making here, as he's arguing again for a divine watchmaker by pointing out that a watch has certain properties. You can see the idea of irreducible complexity in the description of the watch that Paley brings to the table. But he's also implying that these systems are high-precision systems that are interacting in a fine-tuned, highly precise manner. You could infer that there's an optimality to these systems, that there's an ingenuity to these systems, that there seems to be a purpose for how these systems are constructed. And these happen to be the very qualities that characterize biochemical systems. And so I would argue that when you see irreducible complexity in biochemical systems, optimization, fine-tuning, precision, when you see ingenuity, when you see purpose, these are all markers that positively indicate a mind who is responsible for these biochemical systems. And on that basis, you could revitalize or reinvigorate Paley's watchmaker argument in light of what we know about biochemical systems. Now, we also live in the information age, and we could even add to that list that the presence of information is also likewise a marker for design, and biochemical systems are information systems. But on top of that, we could also look at a number of biochemical systems, and in these systems see them to be direct analogs to man-made designs, man-made constructs, man-made devices. For example, the bacterial flagellum is an electrically powered rotary motor that's replete with motor proteins and rotors and stators and bushings and drive shafts and a universal joint and a propeller. It's electrically powered. It operates at nearly 100% efficiency. And there's a whole host of other molecular motors and molecular machines that are eerie in their resemblance to man-made machinery. In addition to that, we also note that the information systems in the cell resemble human language, resemble the way in which we would construct information and manipulate information and communicate with that information to one another. That there is a genetic code that undergirds this information system, and codes too come from a mind, and the way that the code is constructed in the cell is exquisitely optimized. That the machinery that manipulates DNA during transcription and replication and DNA repair literally are functioning at their essence like computer systems. We have quality control systems in the cell that are engineering marvels. The way in which molecules are produced in the cell are in assembly line-like operations. These different systems are direct analogs to how we produce designs. And when you put it all together, you have a very powerful weight of evidence argument for design. But note how irreducible complexity is functioning in this argument. It is a positive feature that points to the work of a creator. Systems that are produced by human beings are often irreducibly complex. We see irreducible complexity characterizing these systems. Therefore, we could conclude that these systems are the work of a mind. Now, once we've made this positive argument, we can then come along and instead of focusing on irreducible complexity, we can just simply point out the myriad problems with the origin of life. The origin of life is essentially an attempt to explain the origin of biochemical systems through chemical evolution. And the problems are so legion with a chemical evolutionary scenario for the origin of life that we are right to be suspicious about the claim that a blind watchmaker could generate biochemical systems. We don't have to get involved in a debate about whether or not irreducible complexity can be produced in a irreducibly complex systems can be produced in a stepwise manner through co-option. We can present a much more compelling reason to be skeptical of the evolutionary paradigm, completely independent of irreducible complexity. And in doing so, we can now utilize this concept in combination with other features of the cell that point to a creator. And so in this way, I think irreducible complexity is a very powerful argument. So my complaint here with irreducible complexity is not the fact that it's not a potent indicator of intelligent design. It's how that argument has been framed, how the concept has been used to frame the argument for design that I am uncomfortable with. Now, having gone through all of that, I want to now come to Daniel Levite's question, and Daniel says this: are there any books explaining direct arguments against the co-option idea for the emergence of irreducibly complex systems? Well, there are not any books that actually do that, Daniel, but I've been working on a new argument for biochemical design that I think may actually provide a response to this co-option argument that evolutionary biologists make. And this argument for design I've dubbed the Biomimetics / Bioinspiration argument for design. And it's predicated on some very interesting developments recently in engineering, where researchers are basically turning to designs in biochemistry and biology to inspire new technologies. This is called biomimetics and bioinspiration. And biochemical systems are forefront in this activity. Engineers are turning to biochemical systems to inspire new advances in nanotechnology. So, for example, the Bacterial Flagellum is inspiring essentially devices that engineers are developing at a nanoscale that could deliver drugs to targeted cells in the human body. Scientists are utilizing DNA, which is optimized for information storage. Scientists are utilizing DNA as a way to develop new types of information storage media built around the DNA molecule, or digitally harboring polymeric materials. Scientists and engineers are utilizing the DNA molecule and the enzymes that manipulate DNA to build DNA computers that are much more powerful than the most powerful supercomputer systems we have available to us today. DNA has a capacity to conduct electrical current along the length of the double helix, and that current conducting capacity is critical to detect damage in the DNA molecule. Researchers are utilizing this property to build nanoelectronics. These applications in nanotechnology that are inspired by biochemical systems highlight the optimal designs of these biochemical systems, highlight the ingenuity of these designs, and can be used, I believe, to make an argument for design that I call the Converse Watchmaker argument. Now remember, the Watchmaker argument goes something like this. Human designs have certain properties that reflect the work of a mind. We see those same properties in living systems, in biochemical systems in this case. And if certain properties reflect the work of a human mind, and we see those properties in biochemical systems, by analogy, we can conclude that just like human designs require a designer, biochemical systems require a divine designer. That's the Watchmaker argument. Well, the converse of that argument would be this. If biochemical systems are the product of a designer, those designs should be so ingenious, so optimized that they can inspire new technology. And in fact, with biomimetics and bioinspiration, we see that very thing happening. That is, biomimetics and bioinspiration flow naturally as a technology out of a design framework, but interestingly enough, they fit awkwardly within an evolutionary framework. Why? Because evolutionary biologists argue that biochemical systems were produced through an evolutionary process that was driven by this co-option mechanism, where pre-existing designs were co-opted and then utilized to generate new systems with completely distinct functions. But when you appeal to co-option as a mechanism to generate quote-unquote irreducibly complex biochemical systems, the systems that are produced through co-option are cobbled together systems. They're kludge jobs. They should be flawed systems that are imperfect. In fact, if you read what evolutionary biologists write about biological and biochemical systems, the expectation is that these are suboptimal, poorly designed systems. But if that's the case, then why would you use those systems to inspire nanotechnology, to inspire new technologies, to use these designs as inspiration to solve engineering problems? And so, in a sense, biomimetics and bioinspiration as disciplines in engineering and nanotechnology, in effect, undermine the co-option claim that is made by evolutionary biologists as a way to explain the origin of irreducibly complex systems. In other words, co-option simply, if that is the mechanism for how irreducibly complex systems emerge, would be expected again to produce flawed systems that would be unworthy of biomimetics and bioinspiration. And the fact that these systems are so elegantly designed, as evidenced by the fact that they can be utilized in bioinspiration and biomimetics, essentially means that it's unlikely that co-option was the way to produce these systems. So I believe that this new argument for design that I'm working on may very well be capable of rescuing irreducible complexity and the way in which ID proponents, creationists, and Christian apologists often use irreducible complexity as an argument for design. So I've kind of gone full circle when it comes to the argument for design using irreducible complexity, from being enamored by the argument and utilizing it myself to kind of growing sour on the argument based on this paper published in 2009 by, again, researchers from Australia and the United Kingdom, to now in the last few months returning to irreducible complexity as perhaps a potent argument for design, because we can now respond to that co-option claim based on what's happening in biomimetics and bioinspiration. But even having said that, my preference when I use irreducible complexity to argue for design is to incorporate it into, again, a positive argument for design that is built on myriad features that point to design, not a single isolated feature. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and bring things to a close, and I just want to make sure people understand that how much I really deeply admire Michael Behe, again, as a scholar, as a Christian gentleman, as a man of courage. He has been inspirational to me in my career as a Christian apologist. I owe him a huge debt of gratitude, and it pains me to be critical of the way in which he framed the argument for design from irreducible complexity. It pains me to be critical of him in that way. But on the other hand, I want to make sure that as we're engaging skeptics and seekers who have questions about whether a creator exists because of the claims that come from evolutionary biologists and because of the evolutionary paradigm and its prominence in science, that I want to make sure that as we engage them, we're engaging them with the best evidence for design, with the best arguments for design, with the best, most robust critiques of the evolutionary paradigm. And it means that we must be willing to criticize one another. I would expect no less from anybody else. If they feel as if I'm making a weak argument, I want to hear the criticisms that they're bringing to the table, because those criticisms represent gifts to me and to the Christian community at large and to the ID community at large. We always want to make sure that we are critiquing our own ideas and our own arguments. And believe you me, there are arguments that I've made in the past that I felt were very strong arguments for design, very strong critiques of the evolutionary paradigm that I no longer make because of advances that have happened in science that I think weaken those particular arguments. And so I'm more than happy to retract arguments that I make if they are exposed as being fundamentally flawed. Or if I don't retract them, I'm happy to go back to the drawing board and try to retool those arguments in light of those criticisms. And this is the spirit that I want us to approach apologetics with. This is the spirit that I want us to approach the case for creationism, the case for intelligent design, with the utmost integrity, where we are open-minded, where we're fair-minded, where we acknowledge where our arguments have weak points, and then instead of trying to rebut those challenges to our arguments, that we go back to the drawing board and try to retool our case for a creator and our challenges to the evolutionary paradigm. And that's the spirit in which I offer my concerns and my critiques of the way in which irreducible complexity is used to argue for design. But again, I think that with advances that are happening in bioinspiration and biomimetics, and with this Converse Watchmaker argument that I'm beginning to develop, I believe we actually have a rebuttal to this co-option challenge. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and bring things to a close. I want to let you know that if you want to offer your perspective on irreducible complexity, intelligent design, and evolution, please feel free to do so in the comment section. Even if your perspective differs from my perspective, I want to hear what you think. Also, please take a moment to react to this broadcast using the like button. Offer us suggestions on how we could improve the broadcast in the comment section. And finally, check in. Let us know who you are and where you're watching from. I'm going to go ahead and close with these final words. The more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. God bless each and every one of you. See you next time on Question of the Week.